Welcome. In this session, we will be discussing the first chapter in biology, first view, that is the living world. Biology is the study of living beings or living organisms. The word bios refers to life and logos refers to study. So in biology we study about organisms, living organisms, for example plants, animals and microorganisms. Now let us start with describing life. In short, we can say that biology is the story of life on earth, or biology is the story of how life formed on earth, meaning evolution of different organisms on earth. All these things put together we study in biology. What differentiates a living entity from a non-living being? What are the features that are specific to a living being, to an organism, and what differentiates it from a non-living being? So let us jot down a couple of important features of living organisms. So when we talk about life, one of the important word that comes into our mind is growth. Living organisms, they show growth. Now, for example, if it is a unicellular organism, say amoeba, it has got one cell. When do we say that growth has taken place? When the cell has increased in size, number one, or when there are more than one cell. So similarly in human beings, the human baby is very small, weighs around 2.5 to 3.5 kilograms. Over the years it increases in its weight, in mass. It also increases in length, and the number of cells will also increase like amoeba. So the two important parameters that show growth are, one is there should be an increase in number and there should be an increase in mass. So when number of cells increases as well as when the mass of the organism increases, we can say that growth is taking place. But growth takes place in non-living entities also. For example, if you say forests are growing, mountains are growing in height, rivers, lakes and oceans, they also increase, isn't it? What is very important is in living organisms, the growth is from within, from inside. So living organisms show intrinsic growth from inside, whereas in the case of forests, mountains, etc., growth is taking place on the surface. So that kind of growth is called as extrinsic growth. So therefore growth is not really a defining feature of living organisms, because even non-living organisms show growth. Although it is growth on the outside, it is still growth. Second parameter would be reproduction. Reproduction is the phenomenon where an organism produces another organism similar to itself. Of course, when we say similar to itself, we are talking about sexual reproduction. In class 8th, class 10th also, you have studied about reproduction briefly. So there are two forms of reproduction, sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. Take for example the different types of asexual reproduction. You have studied about spore formation in fungus, about fragmentation in algae, certain fungus, and also protonema of moss. There are binary fission in amoeba. Then there is regeneration. A regeneration where the body part is capable of producing a complete organism. In regeneration also there are two types of regeneration. True regeneration, which takes place in the case of planaria, where the body part will produce a complete organism. Whereas in regeneration, it is simple. The body part, for example, it is seen in lizard and starfish. The cut tail of the lizard will once again grow back. So in here, only the part is growing back. The entire organism is not growing back. Similarly in starfish. So true regeneration meaning the entire organism should be able to grow back from the body part. And also there is vegetative propagation in plants. Parts of the stem, leaf, root can also give rise to new plants. So these are all asexual modes of reproduction. In sexual modes of reproduction, of course, there are two different individuals involved. They produce gametes. These gametes fuse and it produces a offspring which has similarities to both the parents. That is sexual reproduction. But reproduction also is not a defining feature of an organism, because there are certain organisms which are not able to reproduce, meaning these are sterile. For example, take certain human couples, they are infertile, they are not able to produce children. Similarly, take the case of certain mules. A mule is an animal formed out of a donkey and a horse. It is sterile, it cannot reproduce. Certain honeybees, only the queen honeybee can reproduce. The other worker honeybees, they don't reproduce. So reproduction also is not a defining feature of a living organism. Another important feature of living organism is its ability to respond to the external environment. So we can say it as response to stimuli. Organisms are able to sense their environment. For example, human beings, we have 5 sense organs. We can see, we can hear, we can smell, we can taste, and we can touch. That is how we interact with the environment and also with other organisms. Similarly, plants can respond to sunlight, to water. A particular amount of sunlight or darkness is required for a plant to produce flowers. In certain organisms, the length of day and night, climate and weather also plays a very important role in reproduction. So organisms, living organisms, they have the ability to respond to external environment, which is not shown by non-living organisms. Non-living beings, they cannot respond to external stimuli. Therefore, this is important feature of living organisms. Now, organisms are aware of their environment. They can interact with the environment. But human beings, they are not only aware of the environment, but they are aware of themselves, which is called as self-awareness or self-consciousness. Therefore, we can put this as consciousness. So consciousness is a defining feature of a living being. This consciousness may be in part due to what is called as metabolism. Take for example a single-celled organism like amoeba. This amoeba has to obtain food from the outside environment. Then inside the cell, this food has to be broken down. This broken down food is then used to produce energy. The waste materials should be thrown out of the body. So all these are various life processes which are required to sustain the living organism. So the processes such as digestion, respiration, excretion, exchange of gases, etc. all involve certain modifications of chemicals present in the body. Means the proteins need to be broken down, carbohydrates need to be broken down, fats need to be broken down, and sometimes smaller molecules need to be put together, need to be combined to produce larger molecules. In total, we can define metabolism as all the biochemical reactions taking place in a body. Of course, we can carry out these metabolic reactions outside the organism also, within test tubes in laboratories. Metabolism is indicative of cellular organization. That is important. Non-living beings do not have cellular organization. For example, a stone or a table or air, water, they do not perform these metabolic reactions because they don't have cellular organization. So this is a defining feature of a living organism. So growth and reproduction cannot be used to differentiate living and non-living, whereas response to stimulus, that is consciousness and metabolism, can be used to differentiate a living from a non-living. The study of living organisms is what is biology. So we will be studying all this in detail in your entire first year science and second year science. Now, if you look around us, there are so many organisms, right, from plants, animals, insects, fishes, birds, reptiles, amphibians. We have different types of plants, again algae, fungus, etc. A wide variety of animals. Some animals that are herbivores, some are carnivores, some are omnivores. Then if you go into the aquatic life, different variety of small, big, colorful fishes. Then we have different types of snakes, etc. All these things we can see with our eyes. Then there is an entire world that belongs to microorganisms. These are organisms which are very minute, they can be observed only with the microscope. So, if we look around us, there is a lot of diversity in the living world. So, that is what we will see now. Bio means life, living organisms. How many different types of organisms are there and what are the total number of organisms constitutes biodiversity. As we already discussed, there are so many life forms on earth. It is known currently that around 1.7 to 1.8 million organisms have been documented till date. Documented meaning these have been identified, they have been studied thoroughly, and they have been given names. That is what is called as documentation. So around 1.7 to 1.8 million organisms have been identified, characterized and studied. Of course, when we increase the area of our study, the number of organisms increases, meaning there are still a lot more organisms yet to be discovered and studied. So the diversity of life is tremendous. It is estimated that another 5 to 6 million species are yet to be discovered, especially in oceans and seas. Every day new organisms have been identified and studied. That is the beauty of biodiversity. So it is the total number and different types of all organisms. The next question is, how do we study biodiversity? Let us look at that. One of the first things that we need to do when we study biodiversity is naming of organisms. Take for example a classroom of 45 students. Because every student has his or her own individual name, it is very easy for the teacher. Imagine a situation where in the same classroom there are 4 students with the same name. What would happen? That would create a lot of confusion, isn't it? Similarly, in a living world where there are 1.7, 1.8 million different organisms, it is very important that every organism should have its own unique name so that it is easy to study these organisms. So that is how we begin the study of biodiversity, by naming an organism. This is what is called as nomenclature. Nomenclature is the naming of each and every organism. No two organisms can have the same name. Not only that, these names should be easily recognizable everywhere in the world. We cannot use local names or regional names. It would create again confusion, because if we go and ask for 1 kg of, let us say, tomato in Spain or in Russia, they won't understand. But if you say 1 kilogram of tomato, it is very easily recognizable and identifiable. So local names should be avoided and universally accepted scientific names should be given to organisms. One such method of scientifically naming organisms is called as binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature means scientific naming of organisms. Look at the word binomial. So bi means 2. Here every organism has a name which consists of 2 parts or 2 words. Take the example of human beings. The scientific name of human beings is Homo sapiens. So this is the scientific name or binomial nomenclature of human beings. For example, the binomial nomenclature of mango is Mangifera indica. Every organism has its own binomial nomenclature. So it is a scientific naming of organism using 2 words. The first word is called as its generic epithet or is genus name. The second word is called as its species epithet or its species name. This system of binomial nomenclature was introduced by a scientist, Carolus Linnaeus. Also, sometimes the scientist who has named or given the name to the organism is also mentioned. For example, Mangifera indica is written as Mangifera indica Linn. So here Linn refers to the scientist who has given this name. Linn refers to Carolus Linnaeus. Similarly, we have jackfruit, where we have Artocarpus heterophilus lamb, where lamb refers to the name of the scientist. So this is how organisms are named using two words. Now, organizations in the world which have their own sets of rules and regulations and principles and guidelines which they follow to name organisms. For example, we have institutions such as ICBN, ICZN and ICVN. All the names of plants are given by this body, that is the International Code for Botanical Nomenclature. Similarly, for animals, we have International Code for Zoological Nomenclature, and for viruses, we have International Code for Viral Nomenclature. So they are given the job of correctly naming the organism with the binomial nomenclature. Now, there are a few rules that need to be followed when binomial nomenclature is given to any organism. One, these are the rules of binomial nomenclature. Rule number 1, names are always taken from Latin. The scientific names are taken from the Latin language because it is a dead language. The language can never be modified or new words will not be introduced into this language. So whatever the names that were given in the 17th century are still applicable even now and also in the future. So all the names are either taken from Latin or they are Latinized. That is rule number 1. Rule number 2, each name consists of two words. The first word, as you know, is a genus, represents the genus, and the second word, it represents the species. Rule number 3, the genus name, it begins with a capital letter, whereas the species name is written in all small alphabets. When these names are typed or printed, then they are written in italics, and when they are written by hand, handwritten, then these words should be underlined separately. The Homo sapiens, it is written in italics. When it is typed, it should be in italics. Now because I am writing it with my hand, it needs to be underlined separately. That is rule number 4. And you can see the first letter in the genus is always capital, species is written in all small letters. That is about the binomial nomenclature. Binomial nomenclature has 2 or 3 important uses or advantages. One, every organism has its own unique name, so it is very easy to identify and study the organism, and also there is no confusions. That is number 1. Number 2, the species name always tells something about the characteristic of the organism. So by looking at the name itself, we can understand certain features of the plant or the organism. So that is very, very important, and it also helps in easy scientific communication. For example, in one part of the world, if a scientist or researcher has discovered an organism, and if in another part of the world another group of scientists have discovered the same organism, then it is easy for them to communicate their research findings if they have the same name. So it provides for easy scientific communication. That is the beauty of binomial nomenclature. Now, correct naming of an organism can be only done when proper identification is carried out. So the second step in studying biodiversity is identification. For example, like I was already telling you, if two different groups of scientists have discovered a new organism, how will they tell whether the two organisms are same or whether they are different species? So that can be only done when they have correctly identified the characters or properties of the organisms. So identification is basically correctly describing an organism. So the description of characters, or we can say characterization, is very, very important. So just by describing the characters, one should be able to identify which organism is that. For example, when I tell you that there is a four-legged animal which has got long mustache and it has got reddish brown color with black stripes, immediately the image of tiger comes, but not lion. But if I were to tell you that it is a four-legged animal with light brown skin and with the big mane of hair around its head, then you will get the picture of lion, not tiger. Why is it? Because I have correctly described the features of the organism. So with this description, you can identify it and then use it for naming the organism. So identification is the next important step in studying biodiversity. Now, once identification is done, because there are so many organisms, 1.8 million organisms already discovered, it is very difficult to study all these organisms, all these plants, animals, fungus, microorganisms. So it would be easy to study all these organisms if they were placed into simple groups. For example, take the example of a classroom once again. We have grouped all the students in a classroom into girls and boys. This grouping is done based on some observable features. Grouping of students makes the work easier. Similarly, grouping of organisms also makes it very easy to study the organisms. That is what is called as classification. Once an organism is identified, it has been given a unique name, it is very important to classify this organism. So classification is grouping of the organisms. Now, you have an organism. If you were to ask to place it into a particular group or category, how would you go about it? Of course, you will compare the features of this organism with the already discovered organisms. You will compare their similarities and their differences. If a particular organism shows lot of similarities with this particular organism, you would place it in that particular category or group. And if it is not similar, you would keep it in a separate group. Therefore, classification is nothing but the grouping of organisms. How do you group the organisms? Based on their similarities and their differences. Classification of organisms is very important for a few reasons. Of course, the number one reason is it is easy to study the organisms when we group them. Also, when we group them, it gives us a tool to compare different organisms across different groups. So we can compare and contrast their similarities and their differences. Not only that, it helps us to identify an unknown organism, like I told you in the example. If you have discovered a new organism, based on the similarities and dissimilarities, you can place it into one of the already known groups. So identifying an unknown organism would be easier. Classification will tell you about the evolutionary history of the organism. How that particular organism has evolved. Of course, if the organisms are put in a same group, meaning they would have similar evolutionary histories. Two organisms in two different groups will have different evolutionary histories. They would be less related to each other. For example, human beings, chimpanzees and gorilla are closely related, whereas human beings and tigers, dogs, cats are not so closely related, but both are mammals and all these are animals. So even though they are placed into different groups, they have some kind of similarity, but the similarities will be very less, because human beings share similarities with human beings, whereas tigers will share similarities with tigers. So when we are classifying the organisms, classification is not a single step process. In one step you cannot classify it. There are many steps in classification. So animals, then mammals, and again separate groups are there. So there are many steps in the process of classification of an organism. So currently, if you are to classify the organisms, lot of features are studied before you group them. So right from their morphology, that is the features that we can see from outside. For example, as I told you, tiger has 4 legs and then there are brown and black stripes. So that is a observable feature which we can see. That is what is called as morphology. These are features that can be seen. Then we have to look at the anatomy. These are the features that are present inside the body. Means what is the structure of skeleton, what are the different organs, what are the different tissues, etc. So that is anatomy, study of internal features of an organism. Not only that, we need to study the cells, that is cytology, because different organisms have specialized cells also. Based on that also we can classify. Then we can also classify the organisms based on their evolutionary history. So there is a special branch of biology called as biosystematics, which is there to do this. In the earlier days, when organisms were classified, only their morphology, anatomy, cytology, sometimes their ecological habitat, and also the biochemical components present in plants and animals were used to classify. But we know that human beings are more curious. Not only we wanted to classify the organisms, we also wanted to know the interrelationships between the organisms. So how are two organisms related to each other and what is their evolutionary history? So systematics is the systematic study of organisms which compares the interrelationships between organisms. So even this is now taken into consideration for classification of organisms. So it studies the evolutionary relationships of organisms. How two organisms which are very close are related and how two organisms which are placed far apart, how are they related in a evolutionary timeline. So that is systematics. As I told you, classification is not a single step process. So there are many steps when we classify an organism. That is what we study next. The branch of biology which is involved in studying the biodiversity is called as taxonomy. So taxonomy is the branch of biology that deals with identification, naming, classification and also systematics of an organism. So let us study how the different taxonomical categories or groups are studied in the topic taxonomical categories or taxonomical hierarchy.